All right. So today on the podcast, I have my friend Ty Bennett. Ty is one of those guys that's a jack of all trades. He started his career in sales. He built a company with his brother, sold it, hired a bunch of motivational speakers to motivate his sales team. It inspired him to do a career pivot, got into authoring books, speaking on stages, and writing this amazing book that we're going to talk about today, which is The Power of Storytelling. Ty, thanks for joining.
Absolutely. This is fun.
It
Thanks for having me.
was. Oh, I love this because storytelling is connection. It's how we lead,
I think it's how
become.
we process the world, right? We are
Yes.
genetically programmed to learn through stories, to think and remember in stories. We use it in so many facets. For me, it was a huge part of my career evolution. I love the fact that I get to teach it as a skill and dive into it deeper.
Yeah, definitely. So when you were doing sales, you were recording your sales calls
Yeah.
to be able to self-evaluate, hey, how am I doing? What could I improve? And you realized by self-reflection that the storytelling was getting you more deals.
Yeah. So if I go back at age 21, my brother Scott and I started a business as entrepreneurs.
Yeah,
He's 22. We have no idea what we're doing.
I love it.
We're just jumping in, we're trying, and we're failing, which is a great thing to do as any entrepreneur goes through, but especially at that age. And somebody told me you should start recording yourself. If you want to get better, go back and listen to it, see how you sound. And I'd love to say that I sounded great, but the first time I sounded horrible. The first presentation I ever listened to, probably 15 minutes long, I'm talking. There's no place for questions. There's no dialogue. But I said 144 times. I counted. It was the first time I went, there's no confidence in this. Like, I get why people are not buying from me.
Hmm.
And so started to replace those filler words, started to get better, more fluid. Then I recognize I'm just talking at people. I'm not talking with people, changing some of those things and creating more back and forth, more places for that. But at some point, as I was getting fairly good, I started to ask the question of what caused people to engage. Like when I was doing well, they laughed, they engaged, they leaned forward. What was I doing? And it was storytelling more often than not. And I went, that. I want to get better at that.
Okay, so if you're young, how many stories do you really have to share that are applicable?
At that stage, most of them were not my stories. They were more like the product we were selling, success stories, right? When people would go, oh, that's really cool. I'm like, they're connecting with that story. But sometimes they weren't my stories. As it's evolved through the course of my career, they become more of my stories, which we can talk about the process of that and the evolution of that. Storytelling was something I honed in on and went, I want to get better at that. So I started to read everything I could on storytelling. I started to take courses, study people who were speakers or salespeople, and really particularly go, storytelling, what are they doing? How does that work? How do I get better at it? And as I got better, our business got better, right?
Yeah.
We had more sales. We grew that to about 25 million a year in revenue. I found through that process, you mentioned this, as we brought in other speakers, that's something I aspired to be. I loved it. And so I went, speak, I want to do this. As I started speaking, it wasn't on this topic to start, but people would ask me about presenting, coaching them on that, and particularly about storytelling. That's where the book came from, is I went back and went, okay, let me break down what I'm doing. Can I recreate it? Can I teach it as a skill? And that's what I wanted to do with that.
Okay. We just skipped over a whole bunch of magical things that you said. One of them is you have this wildly successful business and you're bringing in speakers to motivate your team. And you're like, I want to do that. How does one pivot from a massively successful business to something where they're a rookie again?
Yeah. So one thing I think that's cool about anything you do in life is if you position it right, you can leverage it to give you a head start. I look at you and what you've done. I'm not saying this is easy, but you've climbed all these mountains and done these incredible things. You can now leverage that to get on stages faster, to put you in a position where people go, let's hear what she has to say. Same thing for anybody else to kind of give them that head start. So I don't feel like I was starting at zero, although you're kind of starting at zero. It's something new, right?
You don't have an income stream, right? I mean,
Right.
you have experience, but you don't have that other piece.
I did a lot of internal training
Yeah.
of our team. And so I didn't feel like I was
Brand new.
speaking for the first time, I felt like I was pretty good. But the interesting thing is, just like anything else, skill grows as you do it more.
Mhm.
When I go back and look at like those first video, oh, I was so bad. Like I thought I was good and I got hired, so I was okay, but I'm so embarrassed to see
Oh,
it
it's so
now.
bad.
Yeah.
Everything's on video now, right? So we all have these video histories. When
Yeah.
I first started podcasting, I'm like, can we take those episodes down? Like, please? It's
Yeah.
just so funny.
But that's the beauty of it. The biggest guy on YouTube, Mr. Beast,
Yeah.
there's a video he posted back when he was just starting and he was like 16 years old. He set it to come out 4 years later. The video is like, this is how many subscribers I have right now. And in 4 years, this is where I think I'm going to be. It's crazy to watch. You would never watch that and think that's the biggest YouTuber in the whole world. No chance. Horrible lighting, awkward, just the whole thing. But it's just practice. It's just reps, right? It's
Well,
just
and they
doing
got
it.
super geeky about all the little pieces that made it better. And I mean, geeky's not a bad word, but like you were getting geeky on, okay, what's working, what's not working, and enjoying that process of fine tuning to where you are.
So I think there's a mindset to this. If you think of what you do as a craft, then you are trying to perfect your craft. You're trying to take it to a different level, which means that you dissect it, you analyze it, you look at it, you try and up level, you change habits. And if you can perfect that craft, it puts you in a different category than everybody else.
Yeah, because you're playing with it.
Yeah.
It's play instead of the serious work thing.
Yeah.
And when you have that space to play and get curious, so much more shows up.
Yeah. It's a constant process of growing, learning, developing. I look at where I am now as a speaker, and I think I'm pretty good.
Mhm.
But I hope that in a couple of years, if I go back and look at videos like this one, I hope I'm embarrassed by it because I hope that I can continue to grow that skill.
Yeah. And so you had this skill naturally, but once you start writing it into a book and really getting, okay, here's the system and here's the process, was that eye-opening or was that pretty
It
natural
still
for you?
was. It's interesting because I've spoken to hundreds of thousands of people on this topic
Yeah.
in every industry you can think of. Often in audiences, I'll ask them to put themselves on a scale like natural storytelling skill, 0 to 5, 6 to 10. Some audiences skew higher because they're high-end salespeople or something. For those who are like 0 to 5, this is super eye-opening.
Mm.
Like I'd never have heard any of these things, totally new ideas. Those that are like 6 to 10, they typically go, I didn't know I was doing that.
Right.
And when you have an awareness of what the formula is, even if you're doing some of it, then you can duplicate it, then you can recreate it. And so it can take you to another level still.
I worked with a speaking coach to develop my speech, and I was looking through this framework and I'm like, oh, here's a better way to even do it. Once you have the framework, you can apply it to all the
Yeah,
different
and
pieces.
then it gives you something to dissect any story with.
Right.
If I understand those things, I know there's a genesis of the story, I have a new experience or whatever, I can now play with it and go, okay, am I bringing dialogue in or what details can I enhance this way? And it gives you things to look at and analyze and make it better.
And when I was reading the book, one of my favorite lines, which is actually later in the book, is you're not retelling, you're reliving.
Mm.
And I think a lot of us, when we tell stories, we don't invite people into them so they can be the character and live them with us.
Yeah.
So can you explain one of the tips somebody could be doing to help make it be a reliving story versus a retelling story?
I think that's one of those biggest things. If you just look at it broadly, if you retell a story, it's all in narration, which means it's in the past. It's hard to feel emotion when it's way in the past. It's hard to experience something with anticipation when it all happened before. As a storyteller, we want to evoke emotion. We want to engage people. We want to pique curiosity. Those things have to be given an opportunity to be present tense. So maybe I can do it this way. One story I love to tell, because it was a huge mindset shift for me, is the very first time I met Stephen Covey. So Stephen Covey, for those who don't know, wrote the book 7 Habits, 50 million copies sold, one of the best thinkers of our time. That book was named the #1 business book of the 21st century by Time magazine. Incredible book. The first time I ever met him was in 2006.
Okay.
He was hosting a political event at his home, and a mutual friend invited me to the event with the purpose of meeting Stephen Covey. And so after I made a large donation, I was invited to go to this event. So I go show up. we're kind of mingling. And after a few minutes, my friend Kevin comes over and he goes, Ty, let me introduce you to Stephen. And he walks me over to Stephen Covey. Now, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of meeting somebody that like, I couldn't believe I was meeting Stephen Covey.
Yeah.
This was a hero. And Kevin introduced me to Stephen by saying, Stephen, this is Ty Bennett. Ty's writing a book. And Stephen was very gracious. He goes, Ty, thanks for being here. Thanks for your contribution. He said, can I ask you a question? What's the title of your book? And I said, it's called The Power of Influence. It's my first book.
Yeah.
And he goes, I like that. Can I give you some advice? This is Stephen Covey. I was like, yeah, can I write it down? And he goes, Ty, make sure you write the book for the reader, not the writer.
Let's say that again.
Make sure you write the book for the reader, not the writer. Now, I listened to that and I went, what do you mean by that? And he goes, a book that's written for the writer, for their own ego, to build themselves up, because that book's just not going to make that big of an impact. But if you write a book for the reader, if your goal is to teach, to inspire, to help people, that book is going to be a home run. Mm-hmm. He goes, I'm a lot older than you. At that point, he was in his late 60s. I'm in my late 20s. He goes, I think you go through life, most of us anyway, and you think life is about achievement, right? What's the next goal? What's the next step? He goes, maybe it's with age, but somewhere you figure out that life is actually about contribution. Oh, it's about how can I give? How can I serve? That was my very first conversation with Stephen Covey.
So did it at that age, did you have a place to plant that?
At least record it and then
come back to it.
I'd already written my first book, or it was about ready to come out. I'd have to look at the exact time frame. Working on that, and I just went, I need to think through. That mindset became foundational to what I teach now, to my approach. Going back to your question, the reason I just wanted to relive that story is think about, I just relived it. I didn't tell you about it. I told you what happened. I let him say it. And when you relive it, it's a different experience.
Mm-hmm. You can tap that energy.
Just take the dialogue. You got to hear Stephen Covey, who unfortunately has passed away, give some of the greatest advice you could ever hear in your life, but only because I chose to relive the story and use dialogue in my story versus just telling you about it. Those little things make the whole experience different for the person listening.
Mm-hmm. When you are telling a story, I kind of feel like it's this arc of like a song, right? You have these high points and these low points and bring people through. If you have a low point, how do you not make it too heavy for the audience?
Well, you have to find a way to bring them up. It could be humor, right? Sometimes just letting that sit and then pivoting
entirely.
Sometimes there's a line that just feels heavy. Sometimes it's calling that out. There's a technique in storytelling that I call reinforcing relatability, where like you can be in a story here and it's like you step out of the story and just dialogue with the audience like, God, that feels heavy, doesn't it? Then you could step back into it and keep moving forward. You can break the fourth wall and talk directly to reinforce the connection. You might use that technique in other places like, God, what would you do in that situation? Can you imagine? Mm-hmm. And then let them process that. But what I'm doing is going, are you with me?
You're doing a check-in.
Right.
Key to that, what you bring up in the book, is when you do those check-ins, give time for the people to check in.
Yeah, there's pausing. I mean, we're getting into like more
granular
presentation skills, but creating pause feels very, if you've never done it, it feels very awkward. I like to think about it from the standpoint, if you're speaking to 100 people, you shouldn't speak differently to 100 than you do to one.
Yeah.
Because if I ask you a question right now and then just kept talking, you would be like, what am I supposed to do? I'm training you to, I don't want you to respond. I don't want you to think. I'm just talking over you. So I have to create the same type of pauses. Now, there might not be the same back and forth interactions, but that same cadence needs to exist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What is the general structure to a story?
A story is struggle to solution.
Do they ever do solution? And I guess they sometimes do end and then come back to it.
Yeah, for sure. You might lead into it with a solution and then backtrack into it. You can craft the story different ways, but ultimately you hook people with the struggle. You help them with the solution. There's something in our bodies and our DNA that we respond to struggle, to conflict, to challenge. It naturally engages us, right? Think about it like a movie. If you were to go to a movie, seeing the preview is supposed to be amazing, and you sit down, you've got your drink in one hand, your popcorn in the other, and you just watch this movie, but it ends up being about a guy that just merrily skips through life. No ups, no downs, no challenge, no struggle. We would all go, that is the stupidest movie I've ever seen. But often what I see, and I'm guilty of too, just like everybody else, is most of our stories that we tell, especially in business, are solution to solution stories. Think about how many businesses you hear that their story basically is, you know what, we're great and we've always been great and
We're
we'll
gonna
always
keep
be
being great.
great.
We're
And
great,
if you
great,
work
great.
with us, that'd be great. And we all exist to solve problems in a business sense.
Mhm.
There's a struggle. Like that's the reason we exist. And if we're being real with ourselves and when we're telling our own stories, we didn't have it all figured out. We had those pivot moments where we thought differently, where we changed behavior. So it requires a level of vulnerability and authenticity, but you weren't born and you just had it all figured out and it's all been great.
Mhm.
And those moments of struggle, that's what people connect with most. And if you can provide a solution, then they want that solution. If you're in sales, it's your product or your service. If you're a leader, it's this new approach or mentality. If you're a speaker, it might be the idea that you're sharing with the audience and you're creating that dynamic where they connect, buy in, and therefore want to act on what you're sharing.
Okay. I like that. When you have a story, where is the line of embellishing it to keep it interesting and not embellishing it too much where it's like a lie?
Yeah. I think that line is a little bit different for everybody. I'm not saying anybody should lie about their story, but for example, you're sharing a story about climbing a mountain.
Yep.
There's so many details to a 7-day, 20-day trip that when you're retelling the story, does it matter if it happened on day 1 versus day 5? No.
No.
Does it matter that this part fits better in the story at this level of the mountain, but it actually happened here? Probably doesn't matter, right? The timing of it might not be right. Or, like, for example, from your stories, you've climbed some mountains twice.
Yes.
In telling of those stories, if you put it into one experience, I wouldn't think that that's lying or embellishing. Now, if you were making up I climbed these mountains and you didn't, that's a
Yeah, yeah,
different
yeah.
animal. So
Okay.
some of those things, I think, when you're telling a story, you're constantly creating questions or piquing curiosity in people's minds, and you have to satiate those questions. So there's no reason to create additional questions in somebody's mind and take tangents away from the idea of the story,
Mhm.
right? I mean, we've all listened to people who aren't great storytellers
You're
that
like, "Where am I? What
they're like
happened?
going
We left this
literally
human over here. I need to know what
literally
happened to him."
yesterday, I'm driving with my 10-year-old daughter, and she starts telling me a story about something that happened in class, and she goes, "Well, there's this boy who," I go, "That's a tangent, you don't need it." And she goes, "Right," and went back to the story, but I was like, perfect that she just took it and went with it because we get lost in those things. So I don't have a problem with a storyteller synthesizing that to make the story more powerful, but making up things I don't think is ethical, right?
Mhm. No, that's good to know. And you have there's like different right? You have struggle versus yourself, struggle versus nature, struggle versus another. Is there one of those that's more powerful than another?
I would say that the most impactful stories are when you can talk about man versus himself, like the real struggles that we've had and how
Mhm.
we've overcome it. Now, to be fair, in context of what you're talking about, if you're a speaker or you're speaking to your sales team, that may not be the time and place. Those may not even be topically relevant.
Mhm.
But if you think about the people who can tell real personal, vulnerable stories of change, those are pretty powerful.
Mhm.
Where we get a little bit more raw with the demons that we've faced or the struggles where we've had to overcome and what it took to get through that. But keep in mind, they're struggle to solution stories. So it's not really helpful for us to air that story as we're in the thick of it.
Mhm.
That's therapy. That's
Mhm.
different.
I think I've read somewhere we were supposed to tell the story from the scar, not the wound.
I like that.
And when someone's I'm like, "Oh," because you can always tell when someone's talking from the wound.
Yeah.
That's when they get stuck in it or you don't get through it as fast.
Yeah. If you do an assessment of your own experiences, some of those hardest things for you didn't really have a lesson in them that you can share that's helpful for other people. It might just be your experience, but others, you came out the other side with something valuable that you can share when it's helpful. Those things can be extremely powerful. I think when you think about the more personal a story is, the more powerful it can become.
Okay.
That doesn't mean you can't tell other people's stories. You asked a question
Yeah.
earlier.
Yeah.
You're pretty young. Were they your stories? No, most of them weren't.
Where are you grabbing them from then?
If you're selling a product, it might be
Somebody else's
client
story when they
success
met.
story.
Yep.
You might grab certain stories from history or other things. What I've found over time is the more I can make those stories mine, they're uniquely personal and powerful for me to tell, and no one else can tell them.
Hmm.
You can become a great storyteller telling the story of Abraham Lincoln or whatever, but there is a piece to that that people have heard the story, they know how it ends. So you've got to really bring some skill to captivate them or a reason for them to pay attention when in our minds we already know how this ends,
Yeah.
right? And so when it's yours, nobody can tell your stories because you lived them and nobody else did.
Hmm.
And the same for me. Some of that's just experiencing life, and you've got to have those experiences. More often than not, though, I think it's more the self-assessment to find them and to realize because they don't have to be huge stories. If you're watching this podcast, you've done things that no one else in the whole world has done. And it's easy to go, well, I could never be Jenn Drummond. But some of the simple stories can teach extremely powerful lessons.
Yeah, the lessons are all this applicable.
Yeah.
It's the mountain's the metaphor.
Yeah.
Everything's pretty applicable to others. How do you make stories more memorable?
I would point out that studies show that people retain information told within the context of a story 500% better.
500% better.
Yeah. So if you think about go back, I mean, you have a lot of kids, but your kids aren't super young. So it's probably been a minute since you've told them really
Good night,
little
moon.
kid
Yeah.
bedtime stories. I could name any of those. And if you haven't heard them for years, you still remember the takeaway, right? The tortoise and the hare, the boy who cried wolf, because that's how our minds process. We hold on to those lessons that way. And so a lot of my career is in helping people who just would share facts and figures or even big numbers that they think have some kind of shock and awe to them. We think that that's going to be more powerful. It's engaging, but it's not actionable. Those are two different things.
Mhm.
There's a quote from Joseph Stalin,
Okay.
the dictator, horrible
Yes.
human being.
Yes.
That quote is extremely morbid, but just follow me on this. Joseph Stalin said, "The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of a million is a statistic." It's an incredibly morbid thought, but it's also true. If you think about huge numbers, you might go, wow, but we don't act on them. We don't know what to do with it because it's so big, it's not actionable.
When somebody falls in a public place and a whole bunch of people are around, no one does anything. But if there's like one person around, that person will run and be like, hey, are you okay?
Yeah, our country's trillions of dollars in debt. It doesn't matter because
'Cause
what
it
does
doesn't-
trillions of
we can't
dollars
even
even
put
mean,
it-
right?
right.
We could look at lots of different examples, but if you share that big number, it affects millions of people, like my neighbor, and tell me Susan's story. I can connect with that
Mm-hmm.
and her experience, and it becomes more actionable. Stories synthesize information. They take complex ideas and make them simple. Now, you ask the question, how do you make it more memorable? I think metaphors are one of those ways that you do that. Not every story needs a metaphor, but some stories, if they need some kind of comparison, it can make it much more memorable. When we're explaining ideas that people are constantly going, I don't get it. How does that work? Right? That should be like a ding, ding, ding. I need a metaphor. For me, a metaphor-based story, when I was 21 as a young entrepreneur, I'm struggling to get anybody to take me seriously. I'm meeting with people, having sales calls all the time, having no success.
Right.
So I take this mentor, a family friend who's a successful entrepreneur, to lunch. I just called him. I'm like, hey, can I take you to lunch? I just want your advice. And he was like, okay, he's just a friend of my parents. I take him to lunch. I explain kind of the whole situation. I'm like, just tell me what to do. I will do anything.
Yeah.
Just give me some advice. And he goes, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to the last 5 people who told you no, and I want you to ask them why. And I was like, I'll do anything but that.
What?
And he kind of talked me through it. And
Okay.
so I did. I went to those 5
Good
people,
for-
cat in hand, and I was like, look, I'm not trying to convince you. I'm not trying to change your mind. I would love your help. Just be honest with me. Like, what am I doing wrong? Why are you not buying from me? I'd like to get better. And I can take it. Just tell me the truth. So all 5 of them had good conversations. And there were a couple of things that were brought up, but all 5 said the same thing. They all said, Ty, it's your age. The time I'm 21, I probably look like I'm 12.
Because you still look like you're 21 right now. So-
I will take it. Thank you. But as dumb as this sounds, I had never thought about that before. So I went back to this mentor and I go, it's my age. And he goes, I know. And I go, what? Like, we had to go do that? And he's like, you needed to hear it. And I go, okay, what am I supposed to do? Because I'm not going to wait till I'm 40 to start a
Right.
business. And he goes, I don't know. And I was like, help me out. Talked about some of those things. And he goes, okay, well, what did other young entrepreneurs do? What did Bill Gates do? What did Steve Jobs do? And as soon as he said Bill Gates, I had this idea. And through some practice and crafting, I created this story. And when I would sit down with people, now I knew they're questioning my age.
You're not saying it, but you know this,
Yeah,
so you're
but
going to
they're probably
defend it,
not
but you
there
don't even know
because
they're
in
doing
the
it.
back of their mind, they're like, why would I listen to this kid? I would sit down, the first thing out of my mouth, I go, Jen, I kind of feel like a young Bill Gates. They would kind of do what you just did, like
Okay,
kind of
okay.
laugh,
Well,
like,
sure.
but I wanted to engage them. And I go, here's what I mean. If you remember, Bill Gates was 19 when he dropped out of school, right? At the time, computers were huge. They're the size of refrigerators, super expensive. Bill Gates told everybody he was going to put a personal computer in every home in the world. People probably thought he was nuts, right? Who's this young, naive entrepreneur? No idea what he's talking about, right? And Jen, here's the thing. I'm not saying I'm going to be as rich as Bill Gates, and I'm not saying I'm going to change the world the same way Bill Gates has, but I do know that I have something here. And I'm just asking you to take a serious look. Is that fair? That story built a multi-million-dollar business. Wow. I told it thousands and thousands. That metaphor stuck and it worked and it gave me that bridge to work with. And if we're being honest, that because of that story is why I'm sitting here.
Yeah.
Because my career would be totally different without that.
Right.
I would have never gone on to build a multi-million-dollar business, sell it, write best-selling books, speak all over the world, be on podcasts. So there is a power in storytelling. Some of it's just finding that key story that you need to move the needle. Metaphors are one of those things. We could dive into details and dialogue. They bring out more memory to the story. They make it more dynamic and bring the story to life. Ultimately, I think part of it is just finding those stories that you connect with and that can resonate the right way.
So the stories and the metaphor are so powerful. When you are going to a company to talk with them, you're doing a pre-call and you're figuring out what their struggles are. Are you trying to then at that point come up with metaphors that are applicable to your stories to tie them into them? Or how are you, I mean, every speech probably has the same foundation, but it has to be tweaked.
I'm trying to teach the same framework, but in
Yeah.
the context of how they're approaching it. Depending on who I'm speaking to, I speak to different industries. Some are salespeople, some are leaders. Sometimes we're keying in on the client success story or realtors, a listing presentation, or wherever they're going to use those key stories. We can flush out what that looks like. Sometimes it's a deeper dive to have a one-on-one call with some of their top leaders, hear some of their stories and ask them questions on how they use stories. I think most of my stories are pretty universally applicable,
Okay.
but sometimes it's just little couple word changes in them that connect a little bit differently. If I can talk to a realtor and say, when you're sitting in a listing presentation, what does that story look like? Or recognize that in real estate or in insurance or anything, they have that story where the client's asking, why would I do business with you? I like to call it the story of how to sell yourself without bragging. Yeah. Keying in on some of those key stories and then applying the framework to that is often what I'm doing.
One of the questions I had as a leader, what kind of story are you using during crisis to maintain morale?
Yeah. Well, that's an important story because I think leaders often give a vision story, right? There's an important piece to this. A lot of times people will ask the question, okay, if the story struggle to solution, the problem is I haven't arrived at the solution. I'm not there. Well, any vision story shows us that solution is more directional than it is positional, right? If we're talking about here's where we are, this is where we're going, not there yet. We're going to instill some confidence in here's the plan moving forward. I think it's important for leaders to recognize the reality of that struggle and talk openly about it. I think sometimes we try and gloss over it and we
Yeah, that
say,
just
you know what,
hurts.
everything is going to be fine, but we've got to feel it. And it's in that I talk about weighted scales from a communication standpoint. On one side is relatability and on the other side is credibility. And I think they have to be weighted. It's in that struggle that you become relatable. If I can describe the struggle to where you go, oh, he gets me. He understands what I'm
Now
going
the
through.
other side goes up.
Then the credibility comes into play.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that for a leader in that situation, to have that real talk of like, guys, we're in a tough spot. This is what we're dealing with. This is what it looks like. Here's how we move forward. I think that becomes an important story that they're telling.
And I like this. In the book, you say partnership is the new leadership. I think we should spend a few seconds on that phrase.
I think that's the approach to leadership that works in today's world.
Cool. I agree.
And I think communication is a huge piece of that, right? And storytelling being a key skill set within that.
Mm-hmm.
But around the time of writing this book, I started a survey of 5,000, ended up being more than 5,000 leaders, and asking them specifically from a leadership standpoint, what do you want from your people, right? You have 10 people work for you, 100 people that work for you, whatever. What do you want from them? What are you looking for? And overwhelmingly, what people came back with is they want commitment, right? We want engaged, motivated, committed, fully invested, an ownership mentality, right? You can say it in a lot of ways, but that's what we want. What I've found is if I step back, I agree. People work for me. I want commitment. What drives commitment? People are not committed to jobs. People are not committed to companies.
Committed people.
They're committed to people. I think the way you show up as a leader directly impacts the way people show up for you. I could give evidence of that in so many areas. My own experience and others I've observed in companies I've worked with, if we show up as a partner with people, which means more open dialogue, more open communication, we're recognizing that leadership has changed. The generation that's working now is different in how they show up and what they're looking for from the leaders who show up for them. I think if we partner with people, we get the best out of them.
What are common mistakes that people make when they're trying to tell impactful stories?
A couple of them that come to mind. One, not enough preparation. Like winging it is not a business strategy. The pushback I get from people is like, I don't want to sound robotic. Well, I don't want you to sound robotic either. So here's the thing. I heard you speak last week. There's nothing about you that sounded robotic. But I also know that's not the first time you've told those stories.
Right.
I like to say that you practice, you rehearse to internalize, not to memorize.
Yes.
Because when you memorize something, it has to be word for word. I have to hit these points. And you get stuck in
The
am I
minutia.
saying it right. It sounds rehearsed, robotic. But if I internalize it, I can just be present. These stories are part of me. I lived them. That's your experience on the mountain. You can share that with passion. Reliving the story changes the experience for the person listening, but it also changes the experience for the person telling the story. Because if I retell a story 100 times, that gets old. But if I relive it, I get to feel the emotion of it. Meeting Stephen Covey was life-changing for me. It's not hard for me to get giddy and feel excited and remember how impactful that was, what he said to me. It stopped me in my tracks. I went, what do you mean by that? I was like, that's so profound. I've never heard that phrase before. Reliving it opens me up as the storyteller too. So I think the lack of preparation, because then you're going to go off on tangents. Then you're going to take that 2-minute story that could be so powerful and you're going to tell it in 5 minutes and it's not going to make that big of an impact.
Yeah.
It's spending some time on it. The second is, I think too often we make ourselves the hero of our own story. And I don't think we should be, and I don't think we are. I think if we're being real with ourselves, yes, there are times that you had to pull yourself up and just push through. Yeah. Where did you learn that? Who was there that gave you one motivating word? That hero changed your perspective. That mentor gave you the line. Your parents set you up for success, whatever
Yeah.
it is. I think that becomes way more relatable too. And so those are two, I mean, we could go into other mistakes, but those two, I think people make those mistakes quite often.
Yeah, I almost feel like you can be more powerful in a story when you're not the center of the story the entire
sure.
time,
For
right?
sure.
When I set a goal, that goal opened doors and gave me a yes or no to lean into. But by taking that action, other pieces came to play. And if I didn't ever say yes to one thing, I wouldn't have gotten down that path. It's truly like how the universe is working through me.
Yeah.
Instead of me, here's some options, Jen. What do you pick? Okay, I picked that. Okay, if you're going to pick that, now this is what's going to happen.
Well, Goethe's poem said, concerning all acts of initiative and creation, there's one elementary truth, that the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too.
Yeah.
That's what you're describing. All of a
Yes.
sudden, you did take that step, but then the right people show up and they reshape your mindset and they give you the skills and the tools. The story is about you, but no one cares about your story
Mm-mm.
unless they see how it pertains to them. If you were to look at you speaking on a stage versus me speaking on a stage, one advantage I would say that is a little bit easier for me is that I don't have as profound a story that my speech is based off of. Now, follow me on that.
Yeah.
Because there's a challenge for you or any of us when we're telling our own story to then take your experience and make it relevant in my life as the audience member,
Right.
right? And we all have to do that to some point. The bigger the story, that's a hard thing for you to do. And also make it relatable, right? You do it beautifully.
I have a
If you
challenge right now that we can workshop for the audience. I have one more climb. And then this Guinness World Record is certified. I funded this whole thing myself
Okay.
because I didn't want to have to report to somebody and say I turned around and have to defend my decision. This last mountain, it's not a struggle mountain. This mountain is like, this is it. I want to bring as many people as I can on this journey because I'd only came to this spot because society was ready for it to come to this spot. Does
Okay.
that make sense?
Yeah.
When I climbed in Antarctica, if I had this goal when I was my mom or my grandma, not an option, right?
Interesting.
Because they didn't have this. Our society has moved so far that, hey, this is what I'm able to do. This is my last climb. How do I reach all these little girls around the world?
That's cool.
How do I reach all these moms? And it's like, listen, you're raising the next leader.
Yeah.
What does your leadership look like? We need to band together. My big struggle right now is how do I make that story inclusive?
I like it. Just the fact that you're thinking about it opens up that idea, that door.
Providence, come knock.
Yeah, that's an interesting experience because at the end of it, there's going to be one person named as a Guinness World Record holder,
Right.
but how do you make that an experience for everybody? And then in the reliving of that, once you put that on stage,
Right.
how do you take that experience so that somebody who's in HR doesn't go, well, I'm never going to do that. So the lessons, I think, okay, you spoke last week and my sons were in the audience. I'm driving home with my son, Drew, and I said, okay, what did you think? It's kind of fun because we can talk about this in a minute. My boys are now speaking with me sometimes. They analyze things differently than kids who are 14 and 15 because we've had lots of let's learn how to speak and let's talk about this. This is what I do. I'm putting you on stage. Like, we're going to dissect it. And he said, she didn't say anything I've never heard before, but it was so powerful, which is such an awesome compliment.
Yes, take it.
You could take this huge experience and bring it down to everyday lessons. That's not easy. I know how much work that takes. And kudos to you and your speech coach and anybody who's been involved in that process because it's not an easy thing to do, right? I love this concept. I'm going to keep thinking about, this idea. This is in Indonesia, right? So there's an element of like, who can you actually get to Indonesia versus including local.
Well, so
right?
one of our ideas was to sell, it's a very expensive climb, and to sell some spots on a flag. If you had daughters or you had a business that was empowering women, like, hey, I'm going to hang this flag at the top of this
Oh,
mountain.
that's cool.
We're going to take a video of it. And you were part of that made this story possible.
That's awesome.
And then they have a piece to share with them. And then we were going to cut the rope up that we climbed with and ship a piece of the rope to everybody that was a part of it.
I like it.
And just to include them in the whole process. How often do you get to be included?
Yeah.
So those of you that are watching, when you are a speaker or an author and you're formulating these stories, collaborating and being like, hey, what could this look like? Not having this definitive thing is where you get to work together and borrow concepts then get this fine line thing that you get to share.
My favorite comedian is a guy named Mike Birbiglia. If you look him up, he's hilarious. He's great. And he's storytelling based comedy. He's a genius. It's incredible. He has a podcast called Working It Out, and he brings on other comedians. Part of the podcast, they're literally just workshopping. He's like, let me throw out this joke idea. And they're like, I like it, but have you ever thought about looking at, like, they're just workshopping as part of it. And that's the idea from a comedy standpoint. Same thing as storytelling. One of my favorite examples that just happened recently, I'm part of the National Speakers Association. They just started this year, they did a storytelling competition. And at the local level, I was one of the judges. And then at the regional level, I was one of the judges. And so the local level here in Utah at our NSA chapter, there were like 10 people competed and we chose a winner. Her name's Michelle McCullough. She went on to the regional. She ended up winning. So she's one of 3 finalists that will speak at the convention and do it in front of everybody.
Oh, awesome.
The coolest part about watching this is the first time I heard Michelle tell that story was 10 years ago. She hired me to help her work on it. And we changed it, workshopped it. And I think it was pretty good. The way she told it now was unbelievable. And she's just kept working on it. I often say, you don't insert humor, you uncover it. She just found humor inside of this story. She figured out the pause. Like, it was when she started, I'm the judge. And as soon as she started, I went, this story's not good enough to win, because I knew the story.
Yeah.
And then she
Nailed it out of the park.
killed it. And I was like, that is the coolest lesson on storytelling. It is a skill.
Yeah.
And if you just work on it, it can be taken to a different level. And she's workshopped it with me, with other people on her own. Like, as she's listening to other things, she's like, oh, that's an interesting technique. I can maybe,
Yeah.
like, it's just ruminating. And she's made the story incredible.
I love it.
I hope she wins, because that would
Of course.
be
Yes.
so like cap
We're
it all
cheering you on. May you win.
Yeah.
We're here. Okay. So your career has shifted too with you have this new speech with like the Ninja Gym. So
Yeah.
talk to us about this.
So you mentioned before, I have 5 kids.
Yeah.
My 2 boys who are now teenagers, 5 years ago, they watched the show American Ninja Warrior and they fell in love. Like
every child
obsessed.
does. But
Yeah.
yours went overboard.
Like,
Yeah.
wouldn't
Like
let it
you
go.
own a gym now. That's how
Yeah.
obsessed. So
well,
there we go.
that's on me. But I own 2 gyms, but they, just got really into it. Right. And so we first started, like, we found a local ninja gym. They started doing classes. Then we started building some obstacles in our backyard, and that turned into our entire backyard. And now we own 2 ninja gyms. As an entrepreneur, I want to support my kids, and it's fun and it's a cool sport. But as I've coached them through this, what I've found, I've never seen a sport that more visually displays the lessons in high performance that I've been talking about from stage for years. Right. And ninja's really visually stimulating.
Oh, for
right?
sure.
Like, I've started posting videos, and just on social media, the reaction, people are like, oh my gosh, it's unbelievable. And so I just wanted to figure out, how could we bring that on stage? And it took a long time to figure out, but now we've built a ninja rig that we have a few of them around the country, and we can build it, put it on stage, and my boys are part of the speech. And we talk about lessons in high performance, and they demonstrate it, and they talk, and it's like the coolest experience
I love
ever
it.
for me to travel with them, for them to be part of it, for them to show their skill, and also have the experience, be exposed to these types of conversations. And so, yeah, we're speaking all over. We just booked our first one in Canada. We're going to
All
Canada
right,
in
over the border.
September. So we just had to renew their passports. But yeah, it's been a really cool, fun experience for me as a dad. Like,
I can't even imagine
it's
anything
so
better.
fun.
I took my kids on a climb with me, and it was my favorite climb.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was great. Okay, so you have a book. Are you ready to share like the title, or is it still working in progress?
It's called Leader of Leaders.
Okay.
And it's the next book in leadership, following partnership, is the new leadership.
Mhm.
Kind of the next step of, how do you build leadership on your team? I think if you look at right now, all the baby boomers that are leaving the workforce, they want to leave legacy, and succession planning is a huge thing that people are trying to figure out. How do I really create this? And on the other side, this younger generation truly want mentorship.
Yeah.
And so we've created a model on how you can do that. So we're working on that. That probably be out next year. It's almost done, and working with landing the right publisher.
And how do
all
you
that.
know, like, when you have enough material to write another book? It just you're in the field enough that you're like, hey, it's time to start talking about this topic because I'm
Yeah.
seeing this struggle.
So for me, I'm constantly gathering material,
Mhm.
right? And some of it's random material, and some of it, like, once I have an idea, then I'm a little bit more focused on.
Yeah, you
Okay.
put in that lens
But
on
yeah,
it.
for me, people often ask, like, how long does it take to write a book? And I'm like, that's not even a fair question, because it's taken me years to gather the material to sit down and write it. I don't know, 3-6 months. Like,
Yeah.
once I'm there, then I
Ready to
know
go.
I have enough that I can jump in and do it. But this book's been a process too, because, we started it, COVID hit, like the whole thing. Um, so yeah, that'll be the next book. I have not written a book around the ninja lessons. Maybe at some point I will.
Maybe with your sons.
Maybe I do that with the boys. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, that will be the next one.
This has been so amazing. Thank you so much for sharing
No,
this
this is
knowledge.
awesome.
How do people find you and hire you? Like, you need to do this ninja speech because it is unbelievable what these kids can do. It is worth every dollar that he charges, and you should pay twice. So,
I appreciate that.
yes.
I'm pretty easy to find. Ty Bennett, TyBennett.com, Ty Bennett on social media. So yeah, I'd love to connect. But this is seriously awesome to just have this conversation with you. But I genuinely, like, you and I've known of each other.
Yeah.
And then I got a chance to see you speak just last week. And like, the ability to take this huge experience and make it so real, I think it's fantastic. It's such a testament to like what I love, and that's the power of storytelling. Your story is powerful because people can relate to it in a very personal way, and there's those lessons that they can take with them. So you're embodying all these things we're talking about, and I love it.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be able to read it and have the awareness to be able to be more intentional about it
Yeah,
and helpful.
cool.